All right, hey guys. Today we're gonna run real quick through some other change that we see during this period. Basically, the fight for rights for women, Native Americans, and Latinos, as well as the emergence of the counterculture and the hippie movement. So I'm going to be moving pretty quick, so you may need to pause a couple times to make sure you get the information and just hang on with me as we run through it. All right, so the women's liberation movement is a movement that begins in the mid to late '60s and really kind of continues in the 1970s, and it has different names. You hear it called the women's lib movement, the feminist movement, equal rights movement, all of those kinds of things. But the core belief of this movement is the idea of feminism, this idea that men and women should be equally and socially, politically, and economically equal to one another. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually is kind of the first step because it does ban discrimination in employment. However, the enforcement of it does not really attack employment discrimination based on gender as much as it does on race, religion, creed. But it is a step. The main organization that develops during this time is NOW, National Organization for Women. And they fight gender discrimination in the workplace, in schools, in the courts, and they lobby government, file lawsuits, have protest rallies, all sorts of things. And one of the major voices of feminism at this time is Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. And we'll be dealing with a part of the feminine mystique in class as we talk about the women's liberation movement. All right, so women's liberation, women's groups start to push for the Equal Rights Amendment. It's a proposed amendment to the Constitution. It basically promises equal treatment for men and women in all spheres, not just employment. Some people saw the ERA as a threat and see feminism as a threat to traditional family values. A good example would be Phyllis Schlafly, who was a famous female leader of the conservative movement that campaigned against the Equal Rights Amendment. Another step for women's liberation was the Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade, which allowed abortion and protected a woman's right to protect a woman's right to abortion as a violation of privacy, or as a guarantee of privacy, I should say. And of course, that sparked a debate that continues to this day. But it does basically establish the idea that a woman's reproductive rights are her own personal, private decision, and that's an important step, even for those who do or don't agree with abortion. All right, so some of the impacts of the women's movement are far-reaching. You have more women holding professional jobs, doctors, lawyers, professors, scientists, all sorts of things. You have more people moving in, more women moving into senior positions of Congress, in government. More elected to Congress. You've had since then a woman, Hillary Clinton, been nominated or has run for a major nomination in the Democratic Party. You've had women serve as cabinet officials in larger numbers. So even though in the late 70s the feminist movement begins to slow its pace, because the benefits are kind of seen as benefiting more so upper class women rather than poor minorities because of lack of access to education. The movement does have a major impact on American society. All right, Native Americans are also kind of not riding the coattails, but are moving along with the momentum of the civil rights movement, the broader civil rights movement, and all of these groups kind of work in together. Many feminists begin with civil rights, but anyway. So Native Americans largely had missed out on the prosperity of the 1950s. They had the highest unemployment rates in the nation. Average income was less than half of white American men, and they suffered disproportionately from poor health due to lack of access, lack of nutrition, all sorts of things. So basically the government instituted termination policy, and this idea to get Native Americans off of isolated reservations and into mainstream society. Basically, the policy turned out to be a disaster. because what happened is Native Americans were left in neglected reservations, and it turned out to be a public policy disaster, and this led to the Red Power movement. And this begins in 1961 when 700 Native Americans opposed the termination policy and drafted the Declaration of Indian Purpose. And this again marks the beginning of the Red Power movement, very similar to the Black Power movement that will develop as well. So Johnson did establish National Council on Indian Opportunity to get Native Americans more involved in setting public policy regarding Indian affairs. However, most of the change is not going to be top down. It's going to be forced from the bottom up from Native American activists. Congress passed laws that enhance education, health care, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. So that's going to be some of the important events that we see. A group of Native Americans, for instance, occupy the prison on Alcatraz, which had belonged to Native Americans. The island had belonged to a Native American group, centuries ago. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, basically, they said, gave them the right to use any surplus federal property. And since the prison was no longer being used, it was to be considered surplus. The occupation lasted 18 months. They're finally removed by force by federal marshals. But it does draw public attention to the plight of Native Americans. And as a result, New Mexico actually returns tens of thousands of acres to the Pueblo in 1970 of surplus territory. Another movement, or another group that is founded, is the American Indian Movement, and founded in Minnesota in 1968, and it kind of becomes the driving force behind the Red Power movement. One of its most outspoken leaders is Russell Means, and he's still alive today. Very outspoken Indian leader, and actually they actually used force sometimes. They occupied Wounded Knee, had a trail of broken treaties. All of these things are examples of Native Americans refusing to give in to the demands of the government. So other organizations to develop, you have the National Indian Education Association, which obviously improves the fight education for Native Americans. Native American Rights Fund, which provides legal services for natives that are trying to fight for their property and things of that nature. Council on Energy Resource Tribes. This helps member nations gain control over natural resources in their territories and whether or not to protect them or whether to develop them for business. And all these groups work to protect Native Americans' rights, improve the standard of living, and of course to maintain Native American culture. They've had different levels of success. I mean, you have enhanced education, health care, voting rights, religious freedom for Native Americans. There was a resurgence of Native pride during this time. The Red Power movement really pushed that. However, Native Americans still, by and large, lag behind the rest of America when it comes to unemployment, high school dropout rate, life expectancy, all of these types of things. So they're all problems that continue today. All right, another group that's pushing for rights during this time are Latinos. Again, the Civil Rights Movement kind of spawns all these other movements. And by 1960, nearly 1 million Latinos lived in the United States. And 1/3 of every Mexican-American family in the U.S. at that time was below the poverty line, much higher than the national average. They face discrimination in education, and you're going to read an article about a high school that kind of tries to address those issues. Had less qualified teachers, fewer resources, much like blacks faced in the South. Latinos had far less power than the size of their population warranted, so they're going to try to address those problems as well. So the idea of social justice, fair distribution of advantages and disadvantages of society, is something that Latinos are going to fight for. And this begins with the Delano grape strike. In 1965, migrant workers were receiving very low wages. And basically, Filipino farm workers began a strike against these wages, and the National Farm Workers Association, most of whom were Mexican American, were Latinos as well, joined in the strike, and they're led by a charismatic leader by the name of Cesar Chavez. And basically, you have this fight being joined. So the Filipino farm workers started the strike. Where Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez agreed to help, and basically thousands of workers walk off the job. This strike lasts for 5 years, so it's a huge commitment to these strikers. The growers finally give in and settled with the union and agree to pay higher wages, and this makes Chavez a national hero of Latinos. Sort of like the Black Power movement, the Brown Power movement, or the Red Power movement, you also have the Chicano movement. And Chicano is a term that means, it's shortened for Mexicano, right? And the Chicano movement really wanted to convey ethnic pride and commitment to political activism. Some of your early leaders, Reyes Lopez Tiarina, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, Jose Angel Gutierrez, and many other leaders join in this Chicano movement. And one of the most powerful organizations was La Raza Unida Party, which is the United Party of the People, more or less. So you also have working class Chicano students form the Brown Berets, which is a militant organization, kind of like the Black Panthers of the Chicano movement. So you have a lot of these different groups. Tiarina basically focuses on land rights, and the fact that, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave lots of territory to the U.S., there's many former Mexicans, now American citizens, had lost thousands of acres over the years. So there is a move to get some of that land back. Gonzalez and the Crusade for Justice, it promotes American nationalism and provides legal aid for Latinos and Hispanics who need help, and also cultural awareness for art. Develops art, publishes a Spanish newspaper, and founds the National Chicano Liberation Youth Conference. And finally, Jose Angel Gutierrez and Mayo tried to achieve economic independence for Mexican Americans. So they organize, they try to help businesses, and also want to gain control over local education. So you have walkouts, and Crystal City is what you guys will read about, or are reading about in class, the Crystal City walkout among students. All right, La Raza Unida basically is a political party that campaigns for bilingual education, improved public services, education of migrant workers, end to job discrimination, and actually it's a political party. So they are able to elect candidates in many Texas cities and throughout the Southwest. However, the party is going to fracture in the late 70s and fall apart. Finally, the Brown Berets, like I said, the most militant. They fight for a lot of the same things that the other groups do, but they expand their protest to include the Vietnam War, which they felt negatively impacted Hispanics at a higher rate than it did whites. And that's true for most minority groups, Hispanics and blacks specifically. The Boricua movement was basically a Puerto Rican movement, so it was different from, say, the Mexican American movement that we would have seen. And they pushed specifically for Puerto Rican rights, but also for self-government for Puerto Rico. And of course, Cubans have always been active in campaigning against Castro's regime, and keeping pressure on the Castro government in Cuba. All right, so that's going to end us up on our discussion of women's rights, Native American rights, and Latino rights during the area that we've been discussing, this era of change. your next video and your last video of this unit will be about the rise of the counterculture and how that impacts the United States. We'll be talking about the hippie movement, and other types of counterculture movements. So we'll talk to you then. See you guys.